A 17-year-old girl took on a part-time job during her summer break and mysteriously disappeared without a trace. For months, police and dozens of residents from her small town searched everywhere, but it was like she had vanished off the face of the earth. Meanwhile, investigators were unraveling a tangled web of strange and conflicting clues until they finally uncovered the shocking truth. Valerie Tyndall was born on August 29, 2005, in Indianapolis, Indiana. She had a big, loving family, her parents, a brother, and 4 sisters. At some point, they decided to leave the big city and move to a tiny town called Arlington, about an hour's drive from Indianapolis. With only a few hundred residents, Arlington was a quiet, peaceful, and safe place. Valerie enrolled in the local school, made friends, and grew to love the small-town life. As a teenager, she started taking on various part-time jobs to earn her first paycheck. She initially worked at local restaurants, before landing a job with a lawn mowing company. This job was perfect for her. It had a flexible schedule that fit well with her school hours, and operating a lawnmower didn't require any special skills or much effort. By 2023, when Valerie was 17, she was working hard to get good grades so she could get into a college to become a veterinarian. She had loved animals since childhood and had long dreams of becoming a vet. That summer, during her school break, she was busy researching colleges and continued mowing lawns to save up as much money as she could before heading off to college. On June 7th, Valerie told her parents she was heading to work, said goodbye, and left. Her mom expected her to be home in a few hours, but as the day went on, it became clear that something was wrong. Valerie wasn't answering her phone, and as evening approached, her mom decided to call her boss. Valerie worked for a neighbor and family friend, Patrick Scott. To her surprise, Patrick told her that not only had Valerie not shown up for work, but she didn't even have a shift scheduled that day. This news made Valerie's parents even more worried. They feared something bad might have happened, but held on to hope. Her mom considered the possibility that Valerie might have lied about going to work and instead spent the day with friends, even though she'd never done anything like that before. In the end, they decided to wait, hoping their daughter would come home soon. They also called everyone she knew, but no one had seen her that day. So, by the next morning, when Valerie still hadn't returned, they decided it was time to call the police. After speaking with Valerie's parents, the police considered the possibility that she might have gone somewhere secretly or even run away from home. Her mom mentioned that Valerie usually didn't work on Wednesdays, but she assumed her daughter had just picked up an extra shift that day. The officers also talked to her boss, who confirmed that Valerie had no scheduled work that day and had last worked on Tuesday. The police questioned her friends and acquaintances, but none of them had seen Valerie or spent time with her. Given the small size of their town, the officers quickly interviewed everyone Valerie might have been with, but it led nowhere. The only lead they managed to find was a witness who saw Valerie driving by around noon on the day she disappeared. But, unfortunately, this didn't bring them any closer to finding out where she was. As days passed without any sign of Valerie, the police became increasingly convinced that she wasn't going to return home on her own. Investigators began focusing on 2 main theories: that she had either run away or that foul play was involved. Valerie's parents were skeptical about the idea of her running away. There were no issues at home, and she had been working hard in school to achieve her dream of becoming a veterinarian. However, the thought of her running away still gave them a glimmer of hope that she was alive and safe, because the alternative was far worse. For several weeks, the police, along with Valerie's family and volunteers, searched tirelessly around their town. Authorities also asked local residents to help locate Valerie's car. The fact that no one had spotted her vehicle in the small town suggested that Valerie had driven it out of Arlington herself, or someone had hidden it. Nearly 3 weeks later, on June 26th, the police finally found Valerie's car parked at an apartment complex in Shelbyville, about 20 miles from Arlington. The license plates were missing, and the doors were locked. There were no signs of a struggle or any useful clues inside the car, but detectives quickly uncovered an interesting detail. The apartment complex where the car was found was a client of the lawn mowing company where Valerie worked. Despite this, Valerie's boss, Patrick, had insisted she wasn't scheduled to work that day. The investigators began to suspect that he might be hiding something and started looking more closely at him. After interviewing residents in the area around the apartment complex, they found another witness who had seen Valerie on the day she disappeared. But she wasn't alone. Her boss, Patrick, was in the car with her. Hearing this, the detectives went to question Patrick. He stuck to his story, claiming he hadn't seen Valerie that day. But when the police informed him that a witness had placed him with Valerie and that her car had been found, his story suddenly changed. Patrick admitted that he had indeed seen Valerie that day. According to his new version of events, they met up in Shelbyville, and Valerie asked him to drive her to a small town called Homer, a few miles from Arlington. She claimed she was planning to run away from home, and that someone would be waiting for her there. Once they arrived, Valerie got out of his car and into another vehicle driven by an unknown man, and they drove off together. Patrick added that the next day, he picked up Valerie's car and left it in the parking lot of the apartment complex where the police later found it. He insisted that he was only trying to help her. But investigators quickly spotted inconsistencies in his story. They had already checked the location data from Valerie's phone, which showed that it had last been active in Arlington, not in any other town. This suggested that something might have happened to her in Arlington, and they confronted Patrick with this information. To their surprise, Patrick changed his story again. This time, he claimed that they met near the apartment complex in Shelbyville, after which Valerie got into his car and they drove to his house. He then left Valerie at his home alone when he went to work, and when he returned, she was gone. Naturally, the detectives found this version even less credible than his previous ones. They asked Patrick to hand over his phone, and he agreed. The detectives found text messages exchanged with Valerie on the day she disappeared. At 11:23 a.m., Valerie had sent him a message saying, "I'll be there soon." And a few hours later, Patrick had replied, "Where are you?" He sent the same message again a little later, but there was no response. All of this raised serious suspicions, and the detectives were highly doubtful of Patrick's truthfulness. They decided to speak with Valerie's parents to ask if they had noticed anything unusual about Patrick's behavior. Valerie's mom shared that Patrick did sometimes act strangely. He had built a close friendship with Valerie, spending time with her outside of work, giving her gifts, and even taking her shopping. Sometimes, the 59-year-old man seemed to behave more like a jealous boyfriend than a boss. However, Valerie's mom didn't take these concerns too seriously. Patrick was a close family friend, and Valerie was friends with his daughter, so her mother assumed he was just being supportive. Yet, one particular incident stood out to her as especially suspicious. Patrick once invited Valerie to visit an aquarium in another city. Her parents allowed her to go, thinking that Patrick was taking his entire family. But they later found out that he went alone with Valerie, which her parents found quite odd. Valerie's mom also mentioned that on the night of June 7th, Patrick and his wife came over to visit their house, where he suggested that Valerie might have run away and might never come back. She also brought up one curious detail that caught the detectives' attention. Patrick had been tracking Valerie's phone location through a special app. He claimed this was for work purposes, but the detectives immediately noticed something strange. If Patrick could simply open the app and see where Valerie was, why did he send her several messages asking, "Where are you?" on the day she disappeared? After piecing together all the information, the detectives were nearly convinced of Patrick's involvement in Valerie's disappearance. However, with only circumstantial evidence and no clear idea of Valerie's current whereabouts, they couldn't yet hold him accountable. Still, the police decided to arrest Patrick for providing false statements, as he had broken the law by lying about not seeing Valerie on the day she vanished. He was formally charged, and the police continued to think what to do next. This move was largely driven by the detectives' hope that after his arrest, Patrick might eventually tell them the truth. But he continued to insist that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. The next step was to obtain a warrant to search Patrick's home, but this process proved difficult. Without any solid evidence, it took several months. Eventually, the police uncovered another suspicious detail. Several of Patrick's neighbors reported that the day after Valerie disappeared, He dismantled and burned his garage in the middle of the night, around 2 a.m. Finally, on October 11th, the police secured a warrant and went to search Patrick's property. His house sat on a vast piece of land with a pond in the middle. For search dogs immediately indicated that there was a scent of human remains coming from the water, so investigators focused their search there. However, no remains were found in the water. The experts suggested that a body might have been near the pond at some point, causing the scent to seep into the water. The police then expanded their search across the property. They requested a helicopter equipped with ground-penetrating radar, and from the data collected, they created a map highlighting areas with some signs of digging. Given the size of the property, the search extended for several weeks. This continued until November 28th, when the police focused their attention on a large pile of construction debris mixed with soil. After clearing the debris, they uncovered 2 wooden crates beneath it. The first contained old VHS tapes and documents, though the police have not yet disclosed their contents. In the second crate, they found human remains wrapped in black garbage bags. The level of decomposition made it impossible to visually identify the person, but the detectives noticed the nails of the deceased were painted in the same color as Valerie's on the day she disappeared. The remains were sent to medical examiners, who quickly confirmed that they belonged to Valerie Tyndall. Following this confirmation, Patrick was charged with her murder, and the detectives brought him in for questioning. Now that Valerie's body had been found on his property, Patrick did not deny his involvement. However, his account once again raised serious doubts. According to his account, they met that day near the apartment complex in Shelbyville for work, after which they went to his home, where his office was also located. Patrick claimed that Valerie began to blackmail him. He insisted that she had been trying to seduce him for some time, and that, on that day, she demanded a new car. If he didn't comply, she threatened to tell everyone he had seduced her, destroying his life. Patrick said he panicked, and a heated argument ensued, escalating into a physical struggle. In the midst of this, he grabbed his belt and strangled Valerie. Afterward, he moved her body to his office and hid it there. The next day, he went to a store, purchased some wooden boards, and made 2 makeshift coffins. In one, he placed Valerie's body, and in the other, he stored documents and old videotapes. He also wrapped the body in garbage bags and duct tape to mask the odor of decomposition. Patrick then decided to hide the crates in a pit that was already on his property, but he needed something to cover them. So, he used the construction debris, which was plenty on his land, and buried the coffins under a layer of soil to secure them. As for the burned garage, the purpose of his action remains unclear. Given that he burned it shortly after the murder and in the middle of the night, it likely has some connection to the crime. Perhaps he needed to destroy certain evidence, and the garage demolition was just a cover for the large fire. It's worth noting that the pit where he buried Valerie's body was only 100 yards from her parents' home, who had been searching for their daughter for almost 6 months. When police asked him how he felt after committing the murder, Patrick calmly stated that nothing in his life had really changed. Naturally, the detectives were skeptical of his entire story. It all seemed like Patrick was trying to portray himself as the victim, justifying his actions by claiming he was being blackmailed. A far more likely scenario was that Patrick had been ingratiating himself with Valerie for some time, hoping for a romantic relationship. On the day of the murder, he might have brought her to his home and attempted to initiate an intimate encounter. But when Valerie refused, he panicked at the thought she might tell her parents and decided to kill her. Another detail that cast doubt on Patrick's version of events was the testimony from Valerie's relatives. They mentioned that she loved her car, and even said once that she wanted to drive it for the rest of her life. This made Patrick's story about being blackmailed for a new car seem even less believable. After charges were brought against Patrick, detectives uncovered several more intriguing pieces of evidence that further built the case against him. A thorough examination of his smartphone revealed that shortly after arriving home on the day of the murder, Patrick began deleting apps from his device. Although, he failed to remove his health app, which recorded a significant spike in his heart rate for several minutes shortly after his arrival. Investigators believe that this was the moment when he killed Valerie and moved her body. Patrick also admitted to disposing of the license plates from Valerie's car and her keys by throwing them into a river, intending to make it harder for the police to locate the vehicle. He also revealed a chilling detail. After strangling Valerie with his belt, he just put it back on and continued wearing it as if nothing had happened. The victim's parents were devastated to learn that their neighbor and friend was her killer. They admitted that they had never truly believed Patrick was involved, despite his strange behavior. It's important to note that detectives had kept most of the information from the parents to avoid compromising the investigation. So many details only came to light after Patrick's arrest. When Patrick was placed in jail awaiting trial and was appointed a lawyer, he didn't attempt to retract his confession, as is often the case. Instead, he and his lawyer negotiated a plea deal. Patrick would plead guilty to the murder, and in exchange, the charges of giving false information for which he was originally arrested would be dropped. Thanks to this deal, Patrick stood before the judge on March 11, 2024, just a few months after his arrest, and was sentenced to 57 years in prison. While the victim's family didn't have to endure years of waiting for the trial and the defense's attempts to justify Patrick's actions, the plea deal came with a significant drawback. Typically, such agreements don't require the guilty party to disclose all the details of their crime. Patrick only needed to admit his guilt in the murder. Because of this, Valerie's parents may never know the real reasons behind the crime, even if the investigator's theory seems closest to the truth. As for Patrick's family, they too were horrified when the police discovered Valerie's body on their property. His wife and children, including his daughter who had been friends with the victim, had lived just yards away from her remains for nearly 6 months, completely unaware. The plea deal also means we may never learn what was on the tapes that Patrick buried in the second coffin alongside Valerie. It's possible their content could have brought additional trouble or even criminal charges, and Patrick may have feared that the police would search his home following Valerie's disappearance. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A girl went to a store just a few minutes away from her house, but she never came back. The police started their search, and over the course of the investigation, they uncovered some pretty strange clues. Still, the mystery remained unsolved for decades until the truth came out in a completely unexpected way. Christy Wesselman was born on April 19, 1970 in Glen Ellen, Illinois. She lived there with her mom, 2 older brothers, and a sister. Their town was considered one of the safest in the area, and Christy loved spending time outside. She'd spend hours wandering the streets with other kids from the neighborhood. At school, Christy was popular and had a lot of friends. She was actively involved in school life and even got elected as vice president of her class. On top of that, she played volleyball and softball. In the summer of 1985, 15-year-old Christy was taking summer classes at school and spent most of her free time hanging out with friends. On July 21st, Christy came home from school around 3:30 p.m. Right after getting home, she decided to walk to a local store to grab a soda and a chocolate bar for herself and her mom. Her mother expected her back in just a few minutes since the store was close by. But as time went on, it became clear something was wrong because Christy wasn't coming home. At first, her mom thought she might have run into some friends and gone off with them. Back then, there were no cell phones, so she couldn't check in with Christy and had no choice but to wait. As evening set in, her worry only grew. She called Christy's friends, but none of them had seen her that day. Growing desperate, she headed to the store herself, scanning the streets along the way. But there was no sign of Christy anywhere. Christy's family spent the next several hours searching for her, but when there was still no sign of her by 1:50 a.m., her mother decided to contact the police. Officers quickly joined the search, starting by piecing together Christy's last known movements. First, they spoke with the clerk at the store she'd visited. The man knew Christy well. He lived nearby and had even babysat her when she was younger. He confirmed that Christy had come by around 4 p.m., picked up some chocolate bars, and left. She didn't mention where she was headed, but the clerk noted that she seemed happy and nothing about her behavior struck him as unusual. Police also found a few other witnesses who had seen Christy at the store, but none of them could recall where she went after that. Investigators spoke to all of Christy's friends, considering the possibility that she might have lost track of time while hanging out with some of them, but none of her friends had seen her that day. The police then focused all their resources on the search and began combing through the streets. But by that time, it was already the middle of the night, making the search even more challenging. Despite their determination, there was no trace of Christie, no clues, no leads, nothing. The search continued through the early morning, and by midday, a new group of officers took over. One of them suggested trying to retrace Christie's likely route. He guessed that she had probably taken the shortest path from her house to the store, a shortcut through a nearby field. Back then, there was a large vacant lot with tall grass between the residential area and the store. Walking around it would take quite a bit of time. For adults driving cars, it wasn't an issue, but local kids who frequented the store or the nearby McDonald's always took a shortcut through the field, where a narrow path had been worn into the grass. The detective decided to follow this trail. As he made his way along it, something unusual caught his eye in the grass. Pushing through the overgrowth, he realized it was a human body, and he quickly recognized Christie. He immediately called for backup, and the body was handed over to the medical examiners for further analysis. Forensic specialists combed through the crime scene for any evidence, but their search came up empty. No footprints, no personal belongings, nothing to help explain what had happened. The medical examiners determined that Christie had died from 8 stab wounds. They also found evidence of SA and collected the perpetrator's biological material. But in 1985, DNA testing was still in its infancy and not commonly used in criminal investigations. So, with no way to analyze it, the sample was stored for future use. Christie's mother also helped police piece together another interesting detail. Christie had been wearing a pearl ring on her finger that day. However, the ring was nowhere to be found, neither on her body nor at the crime scene. Detectives concluded that the killer might have taken it and instructed all officers to keep an eye on pawnshops in case the murderer tried to sell it. With no physical evidence to work with, the police focused on finding potential witnesses who might have seen Christie or the killer near the field. They managed to track down several people who had used the same path around the estimated time of the murder, but none of them reported seeing anything suspicious. It was quite weird because Christie's body was just a few yards off the trail, although it was hidden by the tall grass, making it nearly impossible to spot. Investigators also learned that just a few dozen yards from where Christie's body was found, a family had been hosting a barbecue in their backyard. But despite being so close to the scene, none of them remembered hearing or seeing anything out of the ordinary. An employee at a gas station about 60 yards from the field also worked his entire shift that day, but didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. To the police, the situation seemed bizarre. So many people had been near the crime scene, yet no one saw or heard anything. Investigators theorized that the unknown attacker either followed Christie from the store to the field or encountered her on the path. He likely led her just a few yards into the tall grass and killed her, all without making a sound. Detectives considered the possibility that Christie might have known her killer, which could explain why there were no screams. After all, their town was small and many residents knew each other. Police began investigating all the men who knew Christie, but this effort led nowhere. They also compiled a list of men in the area with prior convictions for violent crimes. Several suspects were reviewed, but none of them could be tied to the murder. For several months, the police made little progress in solving the mystery. They continued following up on tips and investigating new suspects, but every lead brought them to a dead end. This dragged on for 3 long years until an unexpected breakthrough came in 1988. By that time, DNA analysis was becoming a key tool in criminal investigations. Detectives decided to collect DNA samples from everyone who had been a potential suspect in Christie's case over the years. Many agreed to cooperate, and none of their samples matched the biological evidence found at the scene. But there was one person who refused to provide a DNA sample. Dana Henry, a 34-year-old man living near the field where Christie was found, had been on the police's radar from the first days of the investigation. At the time, Henry denied having anything to do with the crime. But now his refusal to give a sample made detectives seriously question his innocence. The police decided to seek a court order to obtain his DNA. Henry appeared at the court hearing and continued to insist he was innocent. However, he was charged with contempt of court and held in a local jail cell for several days. Only after that, Henry agreed to provide his DNA sample. In the end, his DNA didn't match the killer's sample, and Henry was released. Once he was out, he told reporters that he had been held in a jail cell without clothing and was only released after he gave in to the immense pressure and reluctantly agreed to provide a sample. Henry said he spent around $50,000 on legal fees, a significant amount of money at the time. He had to mortgage his home, which he eventually lost, and many of his friends and family turned their backs on him. Frustrated and angry, Henry filed a lawsuit against the police department, but it didn't seem to lead anywhere. Even after DNA evidence cleared his name, some people still believed he was guilty. Years later, Henry admitted to reporters that the whole ordeal had ruined his life, even though he was never formally charged with a crime. For another year, Christie's case remained at a standstill until 1989, when an unexpected twist brought it back into the spotlight. A judge issued a restraining order against a local man who had been bombarding the victim's family with tips about who he believed was responsible for Christie's murder. The man, named Willis, first contacted Christie's relatives in late 1985. He claimed to have information about the killer's identity and started sending them various leads. Each tip was investigated by the police, but every time, it turned out to be either far-fetched or completely irrelevant to the case. This dragged on for almost 4 years until Christie's family couldn't take it anymore. They filed a complaint and a judge issued an order barring Willis from ever contacting them again. Following the restraining order, police decided to investigate Willis himself, but they found no evidence linking him to the crime. In 2000, the killer's DNA was uploaded to the FBI database, but no matches were found. The case remained cold for many years. From time to time, the police revisited it, following up on tips, but they never got any closer to catching the killer. This went on for 3 entire decades. Over the years, the original detectives had all retired or moved on, and Christie's case had been assigned to a new team. Then, in 2015, something completely unexpected happened. One day, they got a notification from the FBI database. The DNA sample from Christie's killer perfectly matched a recently uploaded profile. The DNA belonged to a 62-year-old man named Michael Jones, who lived in a small town called Champaign, about 150 miles from Christie's home. Jones's DNA was added to the database after he was arrested for domestic violence. His wife had reported him to the police, which led to his arrest. According to an Illinois law passed in 2002, anyone suspected of a crime has to provide a DNA sample. Interestingly, the main advocate for this law was the state's attorney from the same county where Christie's murder took place. And this particular unsolved case had been a major factor in his push to get this legislation passed. As soon as the DNA match came through, investigators jumped into action, looking into Michael Jones. The first thing that stood out was that his name had never been mentioned in the case before. He wasn't a suspect, a witness, or even someone remotely connected to the investigation. The detectives simply hadn't known he existed. Michael Jones had a long criminal history. His first run-in with the law came in the mid-70s when he assaulted a woman. But for some unknown reason, he apparently avoided any real consequences. Just a year later, Jones attacked a 27-year-old woman, assaulted her, and left her in a hospital parking lot. When police issued a warrant for his arrest, Michael turned himself in. During his trial, he expressed deep regret for his actions and claimed he had a great respect for the law. That's why he surrendered voluntarily. Jones also insisted that he suffered from serious mental health issues and needed professional help. However, an independent psychiatrist determined that he was fully aware of his actions. As a result, Jones was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. As you might have guessed, Michael was released early for good behavior. He ended up serving just 6 years of his sentence and was back on the streets by 1983, 2 years before Christie's murder. What's even more striking is that his victim wasn't informed of his early release. Later, she stated that had she known, she would have done everything in her power to challenge the decision. A year after his release, Michael got married. But in 1994, his first wife left him and secured a restraining order against him. The reason? He had been showing an unhealthy interest in one of her young relatives. But despite this alarming behavior, no formal charges were ever filed. In 1999, Michael was arrested again, this time for assaulting a family member of his new girlfriend. Detectives also learned that Michael often went on long solo motorcycle trips and frequently visited relatives in Chicago. Given that Christie's town was on the outskirts of his route, it's possible he passed through the area while traveling to see his family. If that was the case, it would explain why he never appeared on the detectives' radar. If Michael was just passing through for a few hours, tracking his presence would have been nearly impossible. Christie's mother said she had never heard his name before. When police first called her to ask about Michael, she didn't think much of it. Over the past 30 years, investigators had contacted her many times with questions, so this just felt like another routine inquiry. But everything changed when police obtained a fresh DNA sample from Michael while he was in prison and confirmed once and for all that he was the killer. They visited Christie's mother in person to deliver the news. After all these years, the man responsible for her daughter's murder had finally been caught. Before formally charging Michael with Christie's murder, detectives spoke with his ex-girlfriend and uncovered more details about him. She described Michael as someone with a volatile temperament. He could be calm one moment and then suddenly fly into a rage for no apparent reason. She also mentioned that he was obsessed with detective books and crime shows on TV. This information led investigators to suspect that Michael might not just be responsible for Christie's murder, but potentially other unsolved crimes as well. His frequent solo trips, criminal tendencies, and fascination with crime stories hinted that he might have known how to cover his tracks and avoid leaving evidence behind. After building their case against Michael, police officially charged him on September 18, 2015, and Michael denied any involvement in Christie's murder. The case eventually went to court, but the wait dragged on for 3 long years. The trial didn't start until 2018. Prosecutors sought a life sentence, but in the end, Michael decided to plead guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. As part of the deal, he wasn't required to reveal any details about the crime, but with the DNA evidence, there was no question about his guilt. As a result, the judge sentenced him to 80 years in prison, with the possibility of parole no earlier than 2095. In other words, Michael will likely never walk free again. Christie's family thanked the investigators for finally bringing the case to a close. Christie's mother also expressed her frustration over Michael's early release in 1983. She pointed out that if he had served his full 10-year sentence, he wouldn't have had the chance to attack her daughter and Christie would still be alive today. Henry, the man initially suspected of the crime, also attended the trial of the real killer. In a later interview, he shared that the accusations had ruined his life, and even decades later, he still hadn't fully recovered. He hoped that seeing justice served would help him heal, but it didn't. Henry also revealed that throughout all these years, no one from the police department ever apologized to him, let alone faced any consequences for the damage they had caused to his life. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A young woman went home on her lunch break, but never came back to the office. Her coworkers called the police and they started an investigation. What detectives uncovered next felt more like the plot of a horror movie than a real case. And yet, piece by piece, they managed to uncover the truth. Carolyn Byington was born on May 30, 1993, in Plainsboro, New Jersey. She lived there with her parents and older sister, and from a young age, she dreamed of seeing the world. After finishing high school, Carolyn went on to study at Lafayette College, where she took part in 2 study abroad programs, which gave her the chance to visit Japan and Germany. During college, she earned 3 bachelor's degrees in international affairs, sociology, and anthropology. After graduating in 2015, Carolyn got a job at a marketing company not far from her hometown, and she rented an apartment in Plainsboro to stay close to her family. Outside of work, she volunteered with a local youth league and stayed active in charity. Over the next few years, Carolyn continued working at this company, giving back to her community and traveling whenever she had the chance. On June 10, 2019, 26-year-old Carolyn decided to go home during her lunch break. She was supposed to be back at the office later that afternoon, but as time went by, there was still no sign of her. Her coworkers started getting worried and tried calling, but Carolyn didn't pick up. The whole thing seemed really out of character. Carolyn was never one to miss work, and she almost never went home during lunch. She usually stayed in the office. By early evening, their concern had turned into serious worry, and they ended up calling the police to ask them to check if everything was okay. Around 6 p.m., officers arrived at Carolyn's apartment complex and found that her front door was unlocked. When they stepped inside, they were met with a horrifying scene. Carolyn was lying on the floor, and from the amounts of blood around her, it was immediately clear she was dead. While the medical examiner began examining the body, investigators started looking for evidence and talking to potential witnesses. One neighbor told police he had heard screaming around noon. He also mentioned that afterward, there were strange noises coming from Carolyn's apartment, like someone was moving furniture around. But no one reported seeing any unfamiliar faces, and the complex didn't have any security cameras. Inside the apartment, police didn't find much to go on either. It looked like the killer had tried to clean the scene with bleach to cover their tracks. Most likely, the noises the neighbor heard were the killer doing exactly that. While investigators searched for security footage from nearby buildings and looked for any other possible leads, the medical examiner completed the autopsy. Carolyn had suffered multiple blows to the head, likely from fists. On top of that, she had been stabbed repeatedly in the neck with both scissors and a screwdriver. There were no signs of sexual assault, and nothing had been stolen from the apartment. But one detail stood out to detectives. The scissors and screwdriver had come from Carolyn's own apartment. All of that helped rule out the two most common motives, robbery and sexual assault, and pointed police towards something more personal. The sheer brutality of the attack also supported that theory. It looked like whoever had done this wasn't just trying to kill, they were full of rage. Police began interviewing Carolyn's family and friends, but no one could think of a single person who might have wanted to hurt her. They all described her as kind, easygoing, and completely non-confrontational. She wasn't in a relationship at the time, and she didn't have any problematic exes who might have held a grudge. Then, detectives turned to her coworkers, and that's when things got interesting. They learned that, on the same day Carolyn left the office for lunch, another employee did too, a 30-year-old man named Kenneth Saul. On its own, that didn't raise any red flags. But what caught their attention was the fact that Kenneth didn't come back to work until late in the day. Their manager told police that Kenneth had called to say he was having car trouble and needed to stop by a repair shop. But later, the manager checked and found out Kenneth had never actually gone to the place he mentioned. Other coworkers had noticed a few strange things too. When Kenneth returned to the office, he seemed nervous, and he had scratches on his hands. At one point during a casual conversation, he even asked if police could arrest someone based only on circumstantial evidence. Police were definitely intrigued by everything they heard and decided to take a closer look at Kenneth. He worked as an accountant, was married, and had recently become a father. His daughter had been born just a year earlier. He had no criminal record and, on the surface, he didn't seem like someone who fit the profile of a killer. Still, detectives couldn't ignore all the red flags and went to speak with him. Kenneth repeated the same story he told his boss, that he'd left work during lunch to get his car fixed at a repair shop. But when detectives asked him for a receipt or any kind of proof, he couldn't provide anything. Later, Kenneth changed his story. He claimed he hadn't gone to a repair shop at all. Instead, he said he'd fixed the car himself in a nearby park. That shift in his story didn't sit well with investigators. For one, the fact that he changed his account at all raised suspicions. And more importantly, Kenneth was an accountant, not exactly the type of person you'd expect to handle serious car repairs on his own instead of going to a mechanic. Still, Kenneth kept denying any involvement in the murder, and police didn't yet have enough evidence to arrest him. But, sometime later, they came across something interesting. While reviewing surveillance footage from nearby buildings, they also pulled dash cam footage from a patrol car that had passed through the area shortly after noon. On the footage, they spotted Kenneth's car, and that completely contradicted his story. Carolyn's apartment complex was located in another town, about 6 miles from the office. Kenneth had claimed he was fixing his car in a park near work, but the footage clearly placed him near her home. Even though this was still considered circumstantial evidence, it strengthened the case against him. Another reason to suspect Kenneth came from the autopsy. Medical examiners had found traces of skin under Carolyn's fingernails, indicating she scratched her attacker during the struggle. Kenneth just so happened to have fresh scratches on his hands, ones he couldn't explain. The only problem was that the biological material recovered wasn't enough to create a full DNA profile. Despite the setback, police collected a DNA sample from Kenneth and sent it to the lab. The results came back inconclusive. Experts couldn't definitively match the DNA found under Carolyn's fingerprints to him, but they couldn't rule him out either. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was enough to keep him in the spotlight. By this point, detectives were almost certain Kenneth was responsible. Over the next few weeks, they kept searching for more evidence, but nothing new came up. Eventually, they consulted with the district attorney and, together, they decided that all the circumstantial evidence might be enough to hold up in court. So, 2 months after Carolyn's murder, police arrested Kenneth and placed him in jail while he waited for trial. And that's when the case took an unexpected turn. As detectives continued building their case, they received a letter from the jail, from none other than Kenneth's cellmate, and what he had to say shocked everyone working on this case. According to the inmate, Kenneth had offered him $15,000 to commit a murder after he got out of jail, and the plan was chillingly specific. The victim had to be a random woman between 25 and 30 years old, and the weapon had to be a screwdriver and a pair of scissors. Kenneth even told him to stab her in the neck and to clean the scene with bleach afterward. Detectives had no doubt the cellmate was telling the truth because, at that point, the specific details of Carolyn's murder hadn't been released to the public. Only the killer could have known exactly what had been used to attack her and how the crime scene had been cleaned. It seemed Kenneth's plan was to make it look like there was a serial killer targeting young women in the same way Carolyn had been murdered. And, since he was already behind bars when the second attack would happen, he figured police would stop suspecting him. But that wasn't all. Kenneth also pitched a second plan to his cellmate, one that was even more bizarre than the first. He said the cellmate could either kill the lead detective on the case, or one of the people police had interviewed during the investigation into Carolyn's murder. If he went with the second option, Kenneth told him to stage the scene to make it look like the person had done it themselves and to leave a note on the body confessing to Carolyn's murder. The hope was that police would believe the murdered person had killed Carolyn and drop the charges against Kenneth, letting him walk free. As for the idea of killing the detective, it wasn't entirely clear what Kenneth expected to happen, but it seemed he thought that without the lead investigator, the whole case would just fall apart. On top of that, Kenneth even gave his cellmate tips on how to avoid getting caught after the murder, all while completely ignoring the fact that he himself had been arrested almost immediately. The whole plan was so far-fetched, it sounded like something a child would come up with. But Kenneth was dead serious. He truly believed this would get him out. After learning all this, detectives asked the inmate to wear a wire and bring it all up in conversation with Kenneth. He agreed, and it wasn't long before detectives had Kenneth on tape, casually talking about arranging multiple murders. That same day, prison staff searched Kenneth's cell and found several handwritten notes confessing to Carolyn's murder. The idea was to plant them next to the body of whoever his cellmate was supposed to kill, just like Kenneth had planned. He wrote the notes himself, thinking no one would even bother to compare the handwriting. With that, Kenneth had not only handed investigators even more evidence tying him to Carolyn's murder, but he'd also racked up additional charges for conspiracy to commit murder. And yet, even with all the disturbing things they'd uncovered, detectives still had no clue why Kenneth had killed Carolyn in the first place. Eventually, though, they got their answer, and it was something no one saw coming. Kenneth remained in jail for several years and, in November 2022, 3 years after his arrest, prosecutors decided to offer him a deal. Despite the mountain of circumstantial evidence, they still didn't have a definitive DNA match, fingerprints, or any rock-solid physical proof tying him to the scene, which made the upcoming trial a risky one. So, They decided to offer Kenneth a deal in exchange for a reduced sentence. He would have to admit to the murder, and Kenneth agreed. He told investigators that he started working at the company back in 2016, 3 years before the murder. That's where he met Carolyn, and, over time, he began to develop romantic feelings for her, despite the fact that he was married. But Carolyn wasn't interested, and she made that perfectly clear. Still, Kenneth wasn't willing to accept that. He kept those feelings to himself, at least on the surface. But, beneath it all, he was slowly becoming obsessed. Kenneth never bothered her or made any overt moves. To most people, it looked like he had simply let it go. But behind the scenes, his obsession with Carolyn was growing stronger by the day, and that quiet fixation eventually spiraled into full-blown stalking. At some point, Kenneth secretly took Carolyn's house keys and made a copy, then slipped the original back without her ever noticing. From that moment on, he began letting himself into her apartment whenever she wasn't home, usually during his lunch breaks. But it didn't stop there. Eventually, he went even further and set up hidden cameras inside her apartment so he could watch her. And Carolyn had no idea. Over the next few months, Kenneth kept returning to her apartment to check on the hidden cameras. And on June 10th, he went back again during his lunch break. What he didn't realize was that Carolyn had also decided to head home that day. And because he'd left the office early, he had no idea. Kenneth was used to Carolyn spending her lunch breaks at work, so her unexpected return completely caught him off guard. According to his confession, he was inside the apartment when he suddenly heard a key turning in the lock. He quickly hid just out of view behind the front door, and when Carolyn walked in, he realized he had nowhere to run. Knowing she was about to see him, Kenneth attacked, slamming her to the floor and hitting her in the head several times. Then, he grabbed a pair of scissors and a screwdriver from her things and started stabbing her, mostly in the neck area. When she was dead, Kenneth tried to clean up the scene with bleach, but there was just too much blood to get rid of. So, he grabbed all the hidden cameras, fled the apartment, and later returned to the office like nothing had happened. In January 2023, Kenneth was sentenced to 45 years in prison for the murder, along with an additional 10 years for conspiracy to commit murder for his attempt to pay a fellow inmate to carry out more killings. Before the sentencing, Kenneth gave a final speech in court apologizing to Carolyn's family. He said, "I'm sorry every day for my choices. If there was any way I could take back things that I've done, I would without any question. I regret immensely the pain I have caused you all. There are no words big enough to describe the atrocities I've done or the misery I've brought on you." He also apologized to his own family who were present in the courtroom. "I'm sorry for the way I am and that I've hidden it from you for so long, my entire life. The facade I put up kept you from seeing any warning signs. I can only imagine the pain I've caused from the shock of learning the truth." Still, many people involved in the case questioned the sincerity of Kenneth's remorse. Not only had he brutally killed Carolyn just to avoid being exposed, but he was also willing to pay his cellmate to murder innocent people, all in a desperate attempt to escape responsibility for his own crime. As for Kenneth's wife, she had absolutely no idea what he'd been doing behind her back, and she filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. Despite his supposed remorse, Kenneth tried to appeal his sentence almost immediately after it was handed down. He argued that some of the evidence had been obtained in violation of his constitutional rights and should have been thrown out of the case. But, in late 2024, the court rejected his appeal, finding no legal issues with how the investigation had been handled, so the original sentence was upheld. At this point, there's little doubt that Kenneth Saul will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Hi guys, my name is Brandon, and today we'll delve into the case of a college student who went back to her hometown and disappeared without a trace. At first, the police thought she had gone somewhere, but soon they began finding extremely disturbing clues. Her fate remained unknown for 16 years, until the truth suddenly came to light in an unexpected way. Rebecca Gould was born on April 28, 1982, in the small American town of Melbourne, Arkansas. She had 3 sisters, But shortly after the youngest was born, their parents divorced. The girls stayed with their mother, but continued to spend time with their dad. At first, they struggled with their parents' separation, but eventually, it made them even closer with each other. They spent a lot of time together, always looking out for one another. After graduating from high school, Rebecca enrolled at Northwest Arkansas Community College and relocated to Fayetteville. One of her sisters was already attending this college, so they had the opportunity to see each other practically every day. The sisters always tried to visit their family whenever they had the chance. Even though their home was just about 25 miles from their college, sometimes it was quite challenging to find time between studies. In September 2004, when Rebecca was 22, she was anticipating the start of a new semester at her college. For a while, she had been considering transferring to the University of Arkansas, and finally, she got the opportunity. Before making the move, Rebecca planned to complete one more semester at her current college. Before the semester began, she and her sister decided to go home for the weekend to visit their family. Rebecca also had a boyfriend who lived in a nearby town. She planned to spend time with her relatives and then stay with her boyfriend. On Sunday, September 19th, the sisters drove home, spent some time with their loved ones, and Rebecca left to see her boyfriend. The next day, she was supposed to pick up her sister and head back, as they had come there in Rebecca's car. However, she didn't show up at the agreed time. Her sister tried calling multiple times, but Rebecca never answered. At first, her family members didn't worry too much. Rebecca was an adult, and they thought maybe she was just catching up on sleep before heading back to college, or spending time with some friends. But by the evening, as time had passed with no sign of Rebecca, her family started to worry. They now hoped Rebecca had just decided to stay in town for one more day and would eventually return home. The next day, their worry reached its peak. Rebecca still hadn't contacted any of her relatives, and none of her friends had seen her. That's when Rebecca's mom decided to contact the police. Officers learned that Rebecca had stayed with her boyfriend, Casey, and went to his workplace. He said the last time he saw her was the previous morning, around 8:30 a.m. Rebecca dropped him off at the cafe where he worked. She then planned to return to his place, pack her things, and meet up with her sisters before leaving. Casey added that Rebecca had promised to pick him up from work, but she never showed. He waited for her in the parking lot, then called his friends, and they all went to a party. The police listened to his account and asked Casey to allow them to search his home, and he gave them permission. The first thing they noticed was Rebecca's car, still parked outside. Inside the house, they found her purse with IDs and her dog. Casey also mentioned she had a small suitcase with some clothes, but it was not found in the house. This started to seem odd. No one had seen Rebecca for a whole day, yet her purse, car, and beloved pet were still at Casey's place. But it wasn't all. One of the officers noticed the mattress didn't have any bedding and was placed on the bed rather unevenly. Lifting it, the police found large red stains resembling blood. The officers then searched the house more thoroughly and found more bloodstains on the floor and wallpaper. In the washing machine, they found bedding with bloodstains. They also noticed a significant amount of bleach bottles in the house, suggesting that someone had attempted to clean up bloodstains. All this pointed to a grim conclusion that Rebecca might not be alive anymore. Although, investigators couldn't find any additional evidence in the house. They also weren't sure if the blood belonged to her, as DNA analysis results would take several days. While forensic experts continued to examine the house, detectives began questioning Rebecca's boyfriend. He could have been the last person to see her before her disappearance, and a large amount of blood was found in his house. Casey stated he had no involvement in Rebecca's disappearance. According to him, the last time he saw her was the previous morning, and since then, Rebecca hadn't been in touch. He mentioned that after spending the night with friends, he returned home to change before his next shift. However, he insisted he hadn't seen any blood splatters on the floor or walls and didn't smell bleach. He also didn't think much of Rebecca's car parked outside, or some of her belongings left in the room. The police didn't rush to take his word for it, but at that point, they didn't have any substantial evidence to suspect him of murder. They decided to interview all his friends with whom Casey spent Monday night, and they confirmed that he was indeed with them until the morning. They provided him with an alibi, and the police continued to look for any other clues. They still had no idea what happened to Rebecca and when exactly she disappeared. All they knew was that she hadn't answered any calls since the morning of the previous day. During the conversation with investigators, Casey had suggested they should look into Rebecca's ex-boyfriend named Justin. The police tried to reach out to him, but he wasn't home and didn't answer any calls. This seemed suspicious. He disappeared at the same time as his ex-girlfriend. However, 2 days later, he got in touch and said he had been at a casino with his father. The police were able to confirm his alibi, and he was indeed out of town. Soon, the detectives got another lead. They had been trying to reconstruct the timeline of events on the day of her disappearance and found out Rebecca had stopped at a gas station near Casey's workplace. She bought herself a sandwich for breakfast and headed towards his house. Employees recognized her from a photo and confirmed she came there after 8:30 a.m., aligning with Casey's account. The police also found the same sandwich in his house, untouched. This indicated that Rebecca returned home, and shortly after that, something happened to her. Considering Casey was at work at this time, it once again raised doubts about his involvement. Soon, the police received the results of the blood analysis found in his house. It matched Rebecca's blood, and experts didn't find any samples of foreign DNA among it. Detectives continued their efforts to solve the case by interviewing all of Rebecca's relatives and friends. They considered that if Rebecca was indeed attacked, it could have been someone close to her with a personal motive. Police also scrutinized all of Casey's friends who might have visited his house, but all efforts yielded no results. This went on until September 27th. A week after her disappearance, investigators discovered Rebecca's body approximately 12 miles from her boyfriend's house. It lay at the base of an embankment near the highway. This area wasn't visible from the road, making it nearly impossible to stumble upon the body accidentally. They also noted that whoever left her there hadn't even tried to conceal or bury the body. Apparently, the perpetrator just drove there, dumped her, and left. Medical experts determined that Rebecca sustained multiple blows to the head with a heavy object, and her cause of death was strangulation. No defensive wounds were found on her body, indicating that the victim was completely caught off guard, possibly without even having time to realize what was happening. Experts also found no evidence of sexual assault. Regarding the time of death, they also thought Rebecca's body had been lying there for a week, but experts couldn't provide a more precise estimation. Meanwhile, the detectives identified the possible murder weapon used by the perpetrator. There was a piano in Casey's house missing one of its legs. They were quite heavy, and medical experts confirmed that their shape matched the head injury on the victim. Casey claimed the missing leg had been loose for a while, and in theory, it could have been easily ripped from its base. However, the police failed to find this leg either in the house or near the location where the body was found. Given the complete absence of evidence, detectives began searching for possible motives for this crime. They immediately ruled out the robbery gone wrong. Nothing was missing from the house except for the piano leg and Rebecca's suitcase. A sexual motive was also dismissed, leading investigators to believe that the killers simply wanted to murder her. Considering Rebecca was killed almost immediately after her return to Casey's house, police speculated that the perpetrator might have been aware of her schedule or had been following her, knowing her boyfriend would be at work that morning. It was also very likely that Rebecca knew the perpetrator. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting she might have let them in herself. According to investigators, the killer spent several hours in the house, attempting to clean up the blood with bleach. After that, they likely carried the body and loaded it into the car to drive it to the embankment. Despite all this, detectives had literally no evidence, so there was no progress in the investigation. They considered the possible involvement of hundreds of people, including acquaintances and relatives of both Rebecca and Casey. They also checked neighbors and even residents of nearby towns, but it led nowhere. Police received numerous tips, but none proved useful. In many cases, locals just voiced their suspicions against other people without backing it up with any real facts. This went on for several months, until the case eventually went cold. Investigators continued to work on it, but they couldn't make any progress. In the following years, the case was reopened several times, passing on to new teams of detectives. But each time, it led nowhere. The problem lay not only in the complete absence of evidence, but also in the lack of understanding the perpetrator's motive. Eventually, the mysterious nature of this case attracted attention from the true crime community. It became the subject of various TV shows and podcasts, where people attempted to finally uncover the truth. One such individual was a journalist named George Jared, who had been following the case from the beginning. He even wrote a book about it and launched his own podcast. For many years, he had been trying to find out who killed Rebecca. One day, he met Jennifer Buchholz, a former counterintelligence officer in the U.S. Army, who was also interested in the case. They decided to join forces and created a Facebook group where they shared their thoughts on the investigation, discussing it with subscribers. In the first few months, they started noticing a subscriber named William Miller who caught their attention for two reasons. The first was that he lived in the Philippines. His interest in an unsolved crime in a small American town, from the other side of the world, seemed strange. Miller was also one of the most active subscribers, leaving numerous comments and even reaching out to the group admins via direct messages. He said he wants to help solve the murder, shared his thoughts on some controversial and unclear moments, and put forth his own theories. He demonstrated a high level of awareness, not only with specific facts from the case, but also with the knowledge of the area where the crime occurred. Eventually, George and Jennifer began to consider his behavior quite suspicious. They decided to keep this thought to themselves to not scare him off and try to extract more information. Soon, they discovered something else. One of the group members was an expert in genealogy, and she tried to understand Miller's connection to the case. With a simple analysis of his profile, she discovered a very unexpected fact. Miller turned out to be Casey's cousin. After this revelation, George and Jennifer decided to contact the detectives on Rebecca's case and share their concerns about his activity. Police reviewed the case files and realized that Miller's name had been there from the beginning. It turned out he had visited the town around the time of the murder. In 2004, Miller was already questioned, saying he came from Texas to help another relative. He mentioned visiting Casey twice, 2 days before Rebecca's disappearance and the next day. The second time, he didn't even enter the house. Rebecca spotted him through the window and informed Casey that someone was standing there. He went outside, spoke with his cousin for about 15 minutes, and Miller left. Back then, he didn't raise any suspicions, but now detectives were taking a keen interest in him. Digging deeper, they found out that Miller had been a suspect in several cases. In 2002, he faced charges of assaulting a minor, and later for attacking his ex-wife after breaking into her home. However, he didn't face any punishment in either of these cases. Later, he moved to the Philippines, got married, had kids, and worked on offshore oil rigs. Police wanted to talk to him again, but without him being in the US, it was practically impossible. They also couldn't contact him, so they had to wait for him to return home. This happened only in 2020. Customs informed detectives that Miller came back to the U.S. and returned to Oregon, where his mother lived. Detectives called her, but she claimed not to have seen her son for a long time, even though they knew he was in town. Realizing she was lying, the detectives decided to go there and bring him in for questioning. Considering there was no evidence against him, the police needed a plan. If Miller had any connection to the murder, they desperately needed to obtain his confession. So, the detectives decided to play it smart. Detective Mike McNeil, who led the investigation, started the interrogation casually, stating they were just re-interviewing everyone involved in the case. Miller replied that he was willing to cooperate and had nothing to hide. The detective asked if he would be okay with taking a polygraph test upon his return to Arkansas. Miller agreed, and then the detective pretended to call the local police chief, asking if there were any polygraph specialists in town by chance. Hearing this, Miller became visibly nervous and tried to change the subject. Meanwhile, the detective pretended to talk on the phone and said that a polygraph specialist would arrive at the station in half an hour. What Miller didn't know is that the specialist was already waiting in the next room. Despite the fact that the polygraph is a pretty controversial tool and its results can't be accepted in court, the detectives had other goals. This unexpected turn of events could catch the suspect off guard and ultimately lead to a confession. Miller asked if polygraph results were admissible in court, and the detective vaguely said they could be in certain scenarios, but didn't specify how unlikely that was. Miller continued to get nervous but agreed to the test, which he failed. The polygraph operator concluded that he had lied about all key questions, including involvement in Rebecca's murder. Detective McNeil continued pressing him and told Miller that experts once again analyzed all the available evidence and found Rebecca's DNA in samples collected from his car. They had searched his vehicle back in 2004, but found nothing and hadn't even taken any samples for further examination. So, there was no Rebecca's DNA found in his car, and the detective deliberately misled Miller. By law, police have the right to use such tactics during interrogation to get a confession. Sometimes, criminals indeed decide to confess, and this was Detective McNeil's only hope. Upon hearing about Rebecca's DNA in his car, Miller fell silent. The detective kept saying they had all the evidence and Miller could only make things easier for himself by confessing. And it worked. Miller suddenly said that he didn't kill Rebecca, but stumbled upon her body. According to him, that morning, he went to his cousin's house and found an unknown man in a mask standing over Rebecca's bloodied body. Clearly, the detective didn't believe this story and continued to push Miller to tell the truth. Eventually, Miller abruptly interrupted him and said, "I'm just going to tell you. I did it. I'm sorry for what I did." According to Miller, that morning he went hunting in the woods near his cousin's house. When he arrived there, he suddenly remembered that Casey's girlfriend had come over, and for some reason, he wanted to talk to her. He knocked on the door and told Rebecca he needed to use the phone. She let him in, and Miller pretended to make a call. Meanwhile, Rebecca returned to the bedroom and he began walking back and forth in the living room. Miller claimed he was overwhelmed by an uncontrollable rage and desire to kill Rebecca, so he grabbed a piano leg and went after her. She was lying on the bed, and Miller struck her several times on the head before strangling her. He then wrapped her body in a sheet, putting it in his pickup truck, and tried to clean the blood from the floor, walls, and bedding with bleach. He then drove to the highway and dumped the body under the embankment. Miller admitted he knew the area well because he went to school in that town. After hearing his confession, the detective asked why he committed the crime. Miller replied that he just had the urge to kill Rebecca without any reason and couldn't control it. At the end of the interrogation, he once again repeated that he had regretted his actions all these years and must take responsibility. After that, Miller was arrested and extradited to Arkansas, but there, he suddenly retracted his confession and claimed his innocence, which could have jeopardized the case. By law, a suspect must confess to a crime before a judge, especially when there is no evidence against them. There was also one more problem. During Miller's arrest, the police officer didn't finish reading his rights because Miller had interrupted him with a question. All this could have potentially led to Miller's release. However, the judge deemed the recorded confession admissible. Miller had the opportunity to commit the crime, knew his cousin's work schedule, and his statements matched all the details of the crime. It is worth mentioning that Miller initially had a guaranteed way to avoid punishment. When the police called him in for questioning in Oregon, he could have simply refused or walked out of the station at any moment. Considering there was no evidence against him, Miller could have refused to continue the conversation, boarded a flight to the Philippines, and left the U.S. for good, never to be held accountable. Extraditing him without evidence would have been simply impossible, and investigators would have had to accept the fact that they would never solve this case. But Detective McNeil believed that Miller himself had a strong desire to confess. His activity in the online group, where he left numerous comments and interacted with the admins, spoke to this. If he hadn't wanted anyone to learn about his involvement, the most logical behavior would have been to stay away from this topic. Perhaps he didn't leave the interrogation room or request a lawyer for the same reason. He simply couldn't live with all this guilt. Despite Miller initially claiming his innocence, he changed his mind again and struck a deal with the prosecution. In 2022, he confessed to the crime and received a 40-year prison sentence. But this story doesn't end there. When Miller was behind bars, he suddenly confessed to several more murders. He admitted to killing 5 more women throughout his life, whose names he didn't even know. According to Miller, he would invite those women in his car, drive them to secluded places, and then kill them. He added that he chose his victims based on their appearance. He targeted young, slim, and short women with light hair. Detectives immediately realized that this description perfectly matched Rebecca's appearance. If Miller was indeed a serial killer, it would better explain his decision to kill his cousin's girlfriend, as she fits his profile. Considering that Miller worked on oil rigs for 25 years, he had lived in multiple different states and could have committed all these crimes. Police have not yet found any evidence to corroborate his claims, and the investigation continues. It is worth mentioning that there are still supporters of Miller's innocence to this day. Some don't believe he could have committed Rebecca's murder without any motive. Others think that Rebecca's boyfriend could have actually killed her and Miller helped him dispose of the body. Some also believe that Miller didn't kill any other woman and made a false confession to the police for some reason. However, all these versions lack any substantial evidence, so Miller's guilt and Rebecca's murder is not questioned at the official level, while further investigations are ongoing regarding the other allegations. Alright guys, share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. A young mom picked up her son from the babysitter and headed home, but she never made it. Police launched an investigation and stumbled upon a series of unexpected clues and witness statements. But, despite their efforts, the search for the truth dragged on for decades. And when the case was finally solved, it sparked widespread outrage because of some truly bizarre details. Stacy Ann Falcon was born on October 23, 1971, in Renton, Washington. She grew up in a loving family and had an older brother, but eventually, her parents split up. Stacy was a cheerful, outgoing girl with a big circle of friends. During high school, she met a guy named John, and they started dating. Soon after graduation, they decided to move to California, and a few years later, they welcomed their son. But after spending several years in California, Stacy and John decided to move back to their hometown. Not long after they returned, their relationship started to crumble, and eventually they went their separate ways. So, Stacy ended up raising Jacob on her own. She got a job as a waitress, rented an apartment in a small residential complex, and worked hard to make sure her son had everything he needed. In the fall of 1994, Stacy was 22 and gearing up to celebrate her birthday. On October 23rd, she decided to surprise her mom by stopping by with her son. Even though they lived in the same city, Stacy's place was pretty far away, and her busy work schedule didn't leave much time for visits. That day, they celebrated her birthday together, and later, Stacy and Jacob headed home. 4 days later, on her next day off, Stacy went out to celebrate her birthday with friends. She left Jacob with a trusted babysitter and spent the evening hitting up a few clubs, having a great time. After midnight, Stacy went back to her son. She got to the babysitter's place around 1:30 a.m., grabbed Jacob, and went home. About 2 hours later, a newspaper delivery worker was starting his morning route in the same neighborhood. As he passed a short, dead-end street, he spotted a parked car with 2 bodies lying on the ground nearby, a woman and a boy. He immediately called 911, and officers soon showed up at the scene with paramedics. It didn't take long for authorities to confirm that both victims were dead. Based on initial observations, the cause of death appeared to be gunshot wounds. Investigators also quickly identified the victims. It was Stacy and her son. Detectives began examining the crime scene, trying to piece together what had happened. Near the car, they found several bullet casings, as well as Stacy's belongings, including her cell phone inside the car. One detail immediately stood out as particularly strange. Both Stacy and Jacob's shoes were found several yards away from the car. It seemed like the killer had deliberately taken off their shoes, but no one could figure out why. What puzzled investigators even more was that Stacy's wallet and jewelry had been left untouched, making robbery an unlikely motive. Another strange detail at the crime scene was the discovery of 3 white buttons that didn't seem to belong to Stacy. This led investigators to believe they might have been left behind by the killer. The car keys were found wedged between the door and the driver's seat. Nearby, Police also discovered used tape. This led investigators to believe that the killer's original plan might have been to steal the car, leaving Stacy and Jacob tied up. But when the perpetrator couldn't find the keys right away, things may have taken a deadly turn. Once the bodies were handed over to the medical examiners, they confirmed that both victims had died from gunshot wounds. Stacy's body also showed multiple defensive wounds, indicating she had fought back against the attacker. This theory was further supported by the dirt on her socks and the trampled grass near the car. Investigators believed Stacy might have managed to break free from the assailant and even get into the car, but she didn't have time to drive away. The attacker pulled out a gun, shot both Stacy and Jacob, and then dragged their bodies onto the road. The medical examiners also found no evidence of Essie, ruling out that as a possible motive. After wrapping up at the crime scene, the police started canvassing the neighborhood, hoping to find witnesses. A few residents mentioned hearing a woman scream and gunshots around 2:11 a.m., but none of them had called the police. They explained that the area wasn't exactly safe, and the sound of gunfire wasn't uncommon. Unfortunately, none of the neighbors could provide any additional information because they didn't see anything. With all the information they had, police ruled out two major motives: robbery and assay. They shifted their focus to potential suspects within Stacy's inner circle and decided to talk to her mother. That morning, she was working her shift at a cafe when detectives showed up to deliver the horrible news. As expected, her reaction was devastating. Overcome with grief, she ran out of the cafe, sprinting several blocks before collapsing on the ground in tears. Once officers managed to calm her down, they began asking if she could think of anyone who might have wanted to harm her daughter. The detectives first learned that Stacy had once lived in the same apartment complex as the babysitter she had left Jacob with that night. But Stacy decided to move out after hearing gunshots near her home one evening. Since then, she had been living in a different neighborhood, but would occasionally leave her son with a trusted babysitter. Next, her mother mentioned that at the time of her death, Stacy was dating a man named Rich. According to her, the relationship seemed pretty normal. Rich got along well with Jacob and spent most of his time living at his own place. The detectives went to speak with Rich, and he told them that he had spent the evening at a bar near Stacy's apartment complex. Later that night, while Stacy was still out celebrating her birthday with friends, he went to her place and fell asleep there, as he didn't feel like driving back to his own apartment after a few drinks. Rich claimed that he woke up early in the morning and initially didn't think much of the fact that Stacy and Jacob weren't home. He assumed they must have come back while he was asleep and then left early without waking him. Rich denied any involvement in the murders and agreed to take a polygraph test. However, the results were inconclusive. The operator flagged several questionable responses, which kept him on the list of potential suspects. Even so, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. Witnesses at the bar confirmed seeing him there that evening, and investigators couldn't identify any clear motive for him to harm Stacy or Jacob. With no solid leads, the detectives decided to dig deeper into Stacy's personal life. They turned their attention to Stacy's ex-husband, Jacob's father. He told them that on the night of the murder, he had gone out drinking with friends, then returned home, played pool with his roommate, and went to bed. His friends backed up his story, but just like with Rich, his polygraph results raised some red flags. Still, there was no evidence linking him to the crime. Forensic experts examined Stacy's car and all the belongings found at the scene, but they couldn't uncover any foreign DNA or fingerprints. With no direct leads, investigators were left at a standstill and had to dig further into the case. Not long after, they received a call from a local hospital about a suspicious man who had shown up in the middle of the night wearing blood-stained clothes. Detectives immediately went to question him and collected his clothing for DNA testing. The man claimed he had gotten into a fight with his girlfriend and denied any involvement in the murders. Despite his statement, police decided to detain him until the lab results came back. However, forensic testing confirmed that the blood on his clothes didn't belong to Stacy or Jacob. With no connection to the crime, the man was cleared as a suspect and released. Sometime later, detectives got another lead. They found out that before picking up her son, Stacy had stopped at a grocery store. When they checked the CCTV footage, they spotted a man talking to her. Unfortunately, they couldn't identify him, and the lead went cold. The next clue came from Stacy's phone. Investigators found that the last incoming call she received was from a man named Scott. When they went to question him, Scott told them he'd been home with his wife and kids that night. He also admitted that they had briefly dated in the past, but their relationship ended when Stacy found out he was married. Despite the breakup, they had stayed on friendly terms, and his wife confirmed that he was at home the night of the murders. Still, something about Scott raised eyebrows. According to Stacy's friends, he had once left her a $100 tip at the cafe where she worked. Considering Scott had a pretty low-paying job and a family to support, this gesture seemed unusual to investigators. As they dug deeper, they began to suspect that Scott might be involved in dealing illegal substances. But while this was an interesting lead, it didn't bring them any closer to solving the double homicide. Still, they didn't rule out Scott's involvement, direct or indirect, and kept him on their suspects list. For the next few weeks, police struggled to find any new leads. But then, something completely unexpected happened. 2 weeks after Stacy and Jacob's murder, officers found Scott's body stuffed in the trunk of an abandoned car. Scott's brother told investigators that, on the day he disappeared, Scott had planned to visit a man named Vince. The brothers had a side hustle fixing up cars, and they'd installed an expensive sound system in Vince's car. But Vince never paid them, so Scott had gone to demand his money. That's why his brother was convinced that Vince had killed him. Police tracked down Vince, who denied any involvement. However, a search of his apartment turned up traces of Scott's blood, and investigators discovered that Vince had been using Scott's credit card after his death. Vince was arrested, and detectives working Stacy and Jacob's case questioned him, hoping he might know something about Scott's potential involvement in their murders. But, unfortunately, Vince had nothing useful to share, and this lead went cold too. For months, the case remained at a standstill, but shortly before his trial, Vince suddenly decided to plead guilty. He claimed that he had killed Scott in self-defense, saying Scott had threatened him. According to Vince, Scott admitted that he had killed Stacy because she was planning to tell his wife about their affair. Vince also added that he and Scott had been involved in selling illegal substances. Detectives, however, weren't quick to buy Vince's story. The timing seemed far too convenient. Just before facing trial for murder, Vince pinned another killing on Scott, along with allegations of criminal activity, conveniently framing his actions as self-defense. Still, with no other leads, police had no choice but to investigate Scott's possible connection to Stacy's murder. But the deeper they dug, the less credible Vince's story seemed. Scott's wife was adamant that he'd been at home with her that night and couldn't have been across town committing a murder. His brother also dismissed the idea of an ongoing affair between Scott and Stacy, saying Scott would have mentioned something like that if it were true, because the brothers were very close. On top of that, Scott's brother insisted that Scott had no involvement in dealing illegal substances. He claimed they both made an honest living repairing cars. Detectives ultimately concluded that Vince's story didn't add up, and it seemed like nothing more than a desperate attempt to dodge responsibility for his own crime. After that, the case went cold. Over time, it was filed away, and no real progress was made. The only person still searching for answers was Stacy's mom. She kept reaching out to detectives, but one by one, they either retired or got moved to other departments. At one point, she was told the case would be handed over to Seattle's cold case unit, but when she tried to contact them, she found out the unit had been shut down due to budget cuts. In the early 2000s, police received a lead on a new suspect. An inmate contacted investigators claiming that his acquaintance, a man named Charles, had confessed to killing Stacy and Jacob. According to the informant, Charles worked with Stacy at the same cafe, and they both were allegedly involved in selling illegal substances. The story went that Stacy had threatened to turn him in, which supposedly led to her murder. The detectives found this story a bit far-fetched, but with no other leads to follow, they decided to dig deeper into Charles's possible involvement. They sent all the existing evidence back to the lab for analysis, hoping that modern technology might uncover traces of DNA missed during the original investigation. But There was one major problem: the lab was overwhelmed with other cases, and the detectives were told they'd have to wait an entire year for the results. In 2002, detectives finally received the call. Using modern tools, experts had successfully identified DNA traces on the gloves and duct tape found at the crime scene, and they had a match. But it wasn't Charles. Instead, the DNA belonged to an entirely different man who had never once been on the police's radar: Jerome Jones. Investigators started digging into his background and uncovered a long criminal history that went all the way back to his teenage years. Jones had been arrested for robberies, assaults, car thefts, and drug-related offenses. Then, in 1995, just a year after Stacy and Jacob's murders, Jones and an accomplice killed a businessman outside his home in California. And in 1998, he was sentenced to life in prison. Detectives also discovered that in 1994, Jones had been living in the same apartment complex where Stacy had lived before moving out due to safety concerns, and where her babysitter lived at the time of the murders. Even more chilling, Jones had worked at the club where Stacy had celebrated her birthday with friends. Detectives traveled to another state to question Jones in prison, but he denied any involvement in the murders. Every following attempt to get him to talk led nowhere, yet a direct DNA analysis confirmed that the biological material found on the gloves and duct tape at the crime scene belonged to him. However, there was a major problem. The DNA on the gloves and tape was considered circumstantial evidence. The detectives knew it wouldn't be enough to secure a conviction. So, they requested an analysis of the biological samples taken from the victims' bodies during the initial investigation, which had been preserved in storage. This time, the experts made a breakthrough. In the samples taken from Stacy's mouth, they identified biological material that matched Jones' DNA. This not only further confirmed his involvement, but also indicated that Stacy had been the victim of SA. Soon, more evidence surfaced. Jones' DNA was also found under Stacy's fingernails, providing yet another link that tied him directly to the murders. With all the evidence in hand, detectives approached a district attorney to discuss filing murder charges against Jones. But they faced an unexpected setback. The DA wasn't convinced the existing evidence was strong enough to directly tie Jones to the double murder. So, he asked crime scene experts to reconstruct the crime scene using the new evidence, hoping to get a clearer picture of how Jones could be connected to the crime. What happened next remains unclear, but for some reason, the case came to a standstill. It's unknown whether the DA's request for a crime scene reconstruction was ever carried out, but in the end, no charges were brought against Jones. Perhaps the investigators felt less urgency to pursue the case since Jones was already serving time for another murder, or they feared that the available evidence wasn't enough to secure a conviction. As a result, the case was shelved again, despite multiple DNA matches connecting Jones to the crime. But the saddest thing is, the police never informed Stacy's mother about these developments, even though she had been tirelessly pushing for any progress in the investigation. For years, Stacy's mother continued reaching out to investigators, but over time, the officers changed, and she eventually lost contact with anyone responsible for the case. Determined to find answers, she began reviewing all the available information on the case with the help of her sister. This effort stretched over 15 years, until in 2017, her sister passed away. From that point on, Stacy's mother carried on the search alone, but every attempt to achieve justice led to a dead end. In 2019, a journalist from Seattle got interested in the case. He contacted Stacy's mother and began digging into the investigation. Eventually, he discovered that the police had matched DNA from the victim's body to Jerome Jones more than 15 years earlier. Shocked by this revelation, he was baffled as to why no charges had ever been filed against Jones despite such compelling evidence. When he shared this information with Stacy's mother, she was devastated. She couldn't believe that, all this time, the police had a suspect tied to the case by multiple DNA samples, yet failed to act on it. The journalist reached out to a former detective who had worked on the case during those years and asked why Stacy's mother hadn't been informed about the DNA match. The detective explained that the evidence seemed too inconclusive at the time to draw definitive conclusions. He also admitted that he had been handling numerous cases simultaneously and simply didn't have the time. The journalist then asked the district attorney the same question. He responded that it wasn't his responsibility to notify victims' families about case developments, so it hadn't even crossed his mind to reach out to her. Finally, the journalist compiled all the available information into a detailed article. The story caused a significant public outcry, almost instantly reigniting interest in Stacy and Jacob's case. When the new team of detectives reviewed the evidence gathered by their predecessors, they too were stunned that no charges had been filed against Jerome Jones and began preparing the case for trial. Around this time, things took a rather unfortunate turn. Jerome Jones, who was still serving time for another murder, was granted parole, even though he was supposed to remain behind bars until at least 2030. This created a sense of urgency for the detectives and the prosecution, so they rushed to bring charges against him before he could be released. By early 2022, they finally brought official charges, and Jones was arrested. Right after his release from the California prison, he was extradited to Washington and placed in custody while awaiting trial. Unfortunately, Stacy's mother did not live to see the day when the man responsible for her daughter's and grandson's death would be held accountable. She passed away just 4 months after Jones' arrest. Despite this, the prosecution was determined to see the case through to the end and secure justice for Stacy and her son. Based on all the available evidence, they presented their version of events regarding what had likely happened that fateful night. According to investigators, Jones allegedly attacked the woman almost immediately after she left the babysitter's house. He either forced her to pull over by threatening her with a weapon, or she stopped for some reason, and that's when Jones approached her car. Based on the prosecutor's theory, Jones' initial plan was to steal her car, but in the process, he decided to assay Stacy. He forced her out of the vehicle and tied her hands, but she managed to break free during the struggle. She ran back to the car where her son had been sitting the whole time, and that's when Jones shot them both. Afterward, he dragged their bodies out onto the road, planning to drive off in the car, but he couldn't find the keys. They were wedged between the seat and the door. In the end, he fled the scene, leaving behind several pieces of DNA evidence. During the preliminary hearings in May 2023, Jones pleaded not guilty, and the prosecution began preparing for trial. As of now, the trial hasn't started yet, and Jones is still behind bars, but with the evidence they've got, there's little doubt about his involvement. And if the jury finds him guilty, he's facing a life sentence. So, this case is finally coming to its logical conclusion, even if it took 3 decades to get here. The crazy part is, Jones probably could have been charged as early as 2002, just 8 years after the murder, but for reasons that still aren't clear, it took a full 20 years to bring charges against him. Even though Jones has been in prison the whole time, Stacy's mom spent years in the dark, heartbroken that she couldn't get justice for her daughter and grandson. And now, as Jones might finally be officially convicted of their murders, she won't be around to see it. Alright guys, share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching.